Knowing that the state's entire case was based on eyewitness testimony, I moved to suppress this evidence. However, the judge denied the motion. This case was going to come down to whether the jury believed the victim or my client. As the trial date approached, the prosecutor contacted me to negotiate a plea bargain. He would accept a plea of guilty for aggravated assault, a step down from felonious assault. For this, my client would get up to 1 to 2 years in prison, as opposed to the 5 to 10 years he risked if convicted under the current indictment. I took the deal to my client. Absolutely not, he said. How can I plead guilty to something I didn't do? I reported back to the prosecutor, and we prepared for trial. On the morning of the trial, as all parties and a handful of spectators gathered in the courtroom, my client and I noticed the crime victim, still dependent on a cane from the bullet injury, sitting in the courtroom. He was waiting to be called as a witness. Just minutes before we were to begin, my client turned to me and asked, "Do you think the prosecutor would take that deal?" "I don't know," I answered. "I'll find out." I approached the prosecutor's table and I asked the 11th hour question. The prosecutor thought for a moment and said, "Sure, I'll take the plea." As I walked back to the defense table, my mind was racing. The unexpected turn of events presented only two explanations, and both were very troubling. Either my client was guilty, or he was innocent, but unwilling to gamble 10 years of his life on the decision of a jury. How many people, especially those of a racial minority, faced with this decision have pled to lesser offenses rather than risk getting sentenced to prison for a decade or more? I could not guarantee that we would win this case. It was his life, and it had to be his decision. He said that he would take the deal. The judge was not one to take a guilty plea lightly. He's quizzed my client repeatedly. Was he sure he wanted to do this? Did he understand his options and the consequences? My client was stuck with his decision. The trial was over before it got started, and the outcome made me half sick. I couldn't imagine pleading guilty to something I didn't do. The likelihood that this probably often occurs dawned on me for the first time. My client and I walked out of the courtroom. He was out on bond and would return in a few days for sentencing. We rushed to hit the elevator button to catch it as the door was closing. It reversed, opened, and we found ourselves staring into the eye of the parking lot crime victim. We got on the elevator. An awkward silence filled the long moment as we waited for the door to close. Then my client turned, stared directly at the man, and broke the silence. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm really sorry." "That's okay," the man answered quietly. His generous response was moving. He seemed to acknowledge that the tragedy of this event was not limited to his own suffering. I was shocked. The elevator door opened. We got off. I pulled my thoughts together and I said, "I'm really glad that you told that man you were sorry. You did it then, right?" "Yeah," he said soberly. "I never intended to shoot him. I never intended to do that." He paused. And then he said, "I was out with friends. It was a dare. One of my friends had a gun, and he pushed it into my hand. I was so nervous, the gun just went off. It was a nightmare." "Okay," I said, collecting my thoughts. "You will do your time for this. And when it's over, you can put it behind you. Do that, and then get on with your life. You can still have a good, productive life." He was sentenced to 6 months to 2 years. He served 5 months and got out a month early for good behavior. He called to tell me he was out, and he thanked me for representing him. I never heard from him again. Experiences like this breed cynicism in law enforcement and prosecutors, and clearly some skepticism is justified. More than 30 years have passed, and clearly, I was more worldly wise than I had been at 28. Nonetheless, this is the story that I had in mind and was in my heart as I was trying to consider the Gillespie case. Was Gillespie innocent? The fact that he had never wavered on his claim of innocence when he could have pled to a lesser crime and served a minimal sentence was a strong argument in his favor. I decided to go meet him. I'm sorry I get emotional. I've written this and I've read it 1,000 times, I think, but I know these people. I know Mark Gotze, I know Jim Petro, and I know Dean Gillespie. One of the things Jim decided to do after he met Dean Gillespie in prison was go meet Dean's parents. So I'm going to just read you that little section. "We met for lunch at a Bob Evans restaurant. I told Nancy afterwards that Gillespie's parents, Juana and Roger, were the salt of the earth. They were Christians, not hiding the fact that they were people of faith, living in a small community, and proud parents. Dean, like his siblings, had been popular in school. The Gillespies did not appear to be in any way dysfunctional. In fact, unlike many complicated family arrangements that can follow one or more divorces, Dean's parents had survived the kind of stressful event that can tear people apart. Everything about them seemed normal, except for the fact that their son had been in prison for nearly 18 years for a crime they were certain he did not commit. Dean's father was quiet. His mother was articulate and obviously bright. The Gillespies told me about Dean's once promising life, his plans for marrying his fiancée, his progress on fixing up the home he had bought, the nightmare of his arrest and conviction, the frustration of all the failed attempts to receive justice. I recalled Steve Fritz, who had rejected Gillespie as a suspect in part due to the veteran detective's conclusion that the perpetrator who committed this bold act of abduction and sexual assault of 2 women in broad daylight was a brazen, out-of-control criminal. This did not match Dean Gillespie or his stable family, home, and life history. Even though Mrs. Gillespie struck me as a strong woman, throughout the conversation, she became emotional, her eyes filling with tears. This had been going on for nearly 20 years. Yet it was still raw for her. The Gillespies wanted me to get involved in the case. I didn't know whether that would even help, but I was past the point of walking away. I told them I would join the innocence effort on behalf of their son. I want to leave enough time for discussion. So I think I'm going to fast forward to what we call the postscript, it still has to deal with this particular case, the Dean Gillespie case. The last edit deadline for this book was technically yesterday, Friday, July 9th, 2010. But that was also the date of the Gillespie hearing before Judge Wagner. We include this 11th hour update on the case. The day before the hearing, Thursday, July 8th, Nancy and I joined Mark Gotze and 2 University of Cincinnati Law School students in a downtown Dayton hotel. Gotze had just finished a grueling pre-hearing meeting with the prosecutors and Judge Wagner. The prosecutors were objecting to evidence and didn't seem to acknowledge the purpose of the hearing. Gotze had argued that the Court of Appeals had ruled that the information on our new suspect met that elusive standard of new evidence. It was now the judge's responsibility to determine if it also met the standard for a new trial, namely, that if it had been presented to the jury, the probability was strong that a different verdict would have been reached. Gotze vented. The prosecutors were fighting the very evidence the Court of Appeals had found worthy of evaluating. Gotze had sought to give the judge his best lecture ever on the rules of evidence, trying to explain that the hearing was about proving that a pattern of very uncommon statements about being a contract killer, about past sexual abuse, the repeated false use of the name Roger expressed by the rapist to his victims and also by our suspect to his girlfriend was reason enough, especially in light of new findings on eyewitness testimony, to grant a new trial for Dean Gillespie. Based on the illogical objections of the prosecutors, the preliminary meeting with the judge had been a disaster. It would be a long night. Gotze and the students worked into the morning hours preparing the evidence items, but would we be permitted to present them? Nancy and I couldn't sleep and finally got up before the sun. We left the hermetically sealed hotel in search of fresh air, a brisk walk, and coffee. Downtown Dayton was dead at that hour. Nancy's phone GPS directed us to a locked building that may have contained a Starbucks. We ended up an hour later waiting for a local coffee shop to open at 7, and then hurried back to the hotel to shower and drive to the hearing. Apparently we weren't the only ones who didn't get much sleep. Judge Wagner had done his homework. When the attorneys met in his office, he acknowledged that the professor, Mark Gotze, had been correct the day before. The judge would hear the evidence. The courtroom filled up quickly with Gillespie's supporters, law students from the Ohio Innocence Project, the press, and others. Just before the judge was about to come in, a door near the bench opened, and 2 armed sheriff deputies escorted Dean Gillespie into the hushed room. Totally white hair, he was dressed from neck down in canary yellow, with the large block letters on his shirt that said, Montgomery County Jail. "You look good, Deanie," a friend from his high school days called out. "Yeah, yellow's my color," Dean quipped, scanning the room and nodding to family and friends. A nervous chuckle came from the crowd, which quickly became quiet again in anticipation of the judge's entrance. The only sound was the breathy sobbing of Juana Gillespie. It was the first time Nancy had seen Dean and his family in person. "They are attractive, warm, impressive people," she said. Dean, his mother and sister, had snow-white hair and the fairest skin Nancy had ever seen. "They're Irish," I explained. Dean's balding spot was deep pink. "There's no way he ever could have had a tan," Nancy said, "let alone a deep tan," she added, referencing the victim's description of the rapist 22 years ago. From the outset, Judge Wagner seemed engaged in the testimony of our witnesses, ruling more often than not in favor over the prosecutor's numerous objections. Steve Clark, an eyewitness expert from the University of California, Riverside, testified on new findings in eyewitness research. Often counterintuitive, the research nevertheless revealed how under circumstances such as those in which Dean Gillespie was identified, errors can be nearly predictive, and multiple eyewitnesses can finger the same innocent man. The judge was attentive. At times he gently waved off the prosecutor's objections as if they were an irritating fly. Was it possible that this testimony was shaking Judge Wagner's assumptions? The judge allowed all but one of our witnesses to testify. Then he called the attorneys into his chambers. The prosecutors were attempting to block the submission of Casey's police records of the copycat abduction and other arrests consistent with the behavior of an out-of-control criminal. "You mean you're not going to stipulate to police reports?" I asked. "The prosecutor's sworn duty is to seek the truth," I added, chiding one of the prosecutors directly. Gotze had been masterful throughout the entire witness testimony in court that day. I had been the bad guy in the sidebar discussions. This reminder to the prosecutor had its impact. His objections became noticeably more subdued. We returned to the courtroom and Judge Wagner apologized for the time that this was going to take. He asked for briefs on legal issues for both sides to be submitted by September 2nd. He scheduled time for responses and set the continuation of the hearing for November 22nd, Thanksgiving week. I turned to Dean Gillespie and said, "I'm so sorry that this is taking so long." "I've been waiting 20 years, he said with a weak smile. "I can wait a few more months." Once again, he thanked me for working on his behalf. "I believe in you, Dean," I said. Dean's parents, family, high school friends, neighbors, and former fiancé, now married with 2 children, had spent another day with him in a courtroom. As I patted Dean's shoulder in a goodbye gesture, my heart again ached for him. Just days before, I had presented the myths in this book to a conference of judges at Ohio's Miami University. Numerous judges I truly respect expressed appreciation for the message. It was as if they had not known much about wrongful conviction. The judges' responses, back to back with Judge Wagner's attentive handling of the Gillespie hearing, brought yet another epiphany in this string of life lessons. This difficult effort to find true justice really isn't about good people in the system versus bad, or smart versus dumb. By the hand of God, my life's trajectory had an unlikely intersection with Clarence Elkins, Michael Green, and Dean Gillespie. Prosecutor Ron O'Brien experienced his unexperienced awakening to wrongful conviction with Robert McClendon and Joseph Fears. Could it be that Judge Wagner was having a similar jarring of his assumptions with Dean Gillespie? From all appearances, Judge Wagner was keeping his word made to me personally. He would look at this case with an open mind. Roger and Juana Gillespie watched attentively as their son was escorted out by 2 armed deputies. They hung back until everyone had left the courtroom to ask how I thought it went. As we went out, I responded, better than I thought it would when we started this morning. I felt good about the day and said that I thought the odds of our getting a new trial had improved significantly. The Gillespies needed some hope. My appraisal no doubt sprang from my own cautious